Chapter 1. The Mysterious Invitation. The autumn rain pattered against the tall windows of Hercule Poirot's London flat like impatient fingers drumming on a table. The great detective sat in his favourite armchair. Legs crossed, a cup of thick aromatic chocolate balanced delicately in one hand. On the small mahogany table beside him lay a single envelope, thick cream-coloured paper, sealed with crimson wax, impressed by a coat of arms he did not immediately recognize. The postmark read Bordeaux, and the handwriting on the front was elegant, almost theatrical in its flourish. Monsieur Hercule Poirot, Whitehaven Mansions, London. Poirot set the cup down with a soft clink and lifted the letter opener, a silver stiletto he had acquired in Venice years ago. He slit the envelope with surgical precision. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, embossed at the top with the same crest. A stylized raven clutching a key in its talons, wings spread over a shield quartered with lilies and a tower. Beneath it, in the same flowing script, Monsieur Poirot, you are cordially invited to Château de la Mort in the Dordogne for a weekend of intellectual diversion and, perhaps, the unravelling of a small mystery that has long perplexed me. Your reputation precedes you, like dawn over the Thames. I would be honoured if you would lend your little grey cells to a matter that is, I assure you, not without its piquancy. The other guests arrive Friday. A car will collect you from Bordeaux-Mérignac on Thursday evening. Do not trouble yourself with trains. All will be arranged. With anticipation, Madame Éléonore Duval Poirot's moustache twitched, an involuntary sign of intrigue. Château de la Mort, the Castle of Death. A theatrical name, perhaps chosen for effect, yet the French countryside was littered with such melodramatic monikers. Still, the raven, the key, the lilies, symbols that tugged at the edges of memory. He had seen that crest before, though where eluded him? He rose, the letter still in hand, and crossed to the window. London lay sodden and grey beyond the glass, gas lamps flickering like hesitant stars. Somewhere in France, a woman he had never met was summoning him to a house named for death. It was, he reflected, either the height of eccentricity or the prelude to something far more sinister. The telephone rang, a shrill modern intrusion. Poirot lifted the receiver. "Poirot, it's Hastings!" came the cheerful voice of his old friend. "I say, old boy, are you free this weekend? There's a capital little shoot in Surrey." "Alas, mon ami," Poirot interrupted, "I am summoned elsewhere, to France, a chateau, a mystery." There was a pause. "You're joking. Would I jest about such a thing?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A Madame Duval invites me to unravel a small mystery. The chateau is called de la Mort. You see, already the drama begins." Hastings laughed nervously. "Sounds like one of your cases, all right? Need me to come along? Moral support and all that?" Poirot considered. Hastings was loyal, enthusiastic, and possessed of a certain bulldog tenacity, qualities useful in their way. But this invitation felt personal, intimate, as though Madame Duval had chosen him alone. "Non, Hastings, this time I go solo, but you will hear all when I return, provided, of course, that I do return." He hung up before Hastings could protest. That evening, Poirot dined alone at his usual table at the Savoy Grill. The maitre d' hovered, attentive as ever, but Poirot's mind was elsewhere. He turned the invitation over in his thoughts like a rare coin. Madame Duval, who was she? The name was common enough, yet the stationery, the crest, the car from Bordeaux. Wealth, certainly. Old wealth, perhaps. And the phrasing, intellectual diversion. A challenge, then, or a trap? Back at Whitehaven Mansions, he packed with his customary precision. 2 suits, 1 charcoal, 1 midnight blue, pressed to perfection. A dozen handkerchiefs, starched. His patent leather shoes, polished until they reflected the ceiling. A small leather case containing his magnifying glass, a notebook bound in Morocco, and a fountain pen filled with violet ink. He hesitated over the revolver in the drawer. Small, elegant, a lady's weapon he had taken from a murderess in Brussels years ago. No, this was a social visit. One did not bring firearms to a lady's house unless invited. Thursday dawned crisp and golden, the rain having swept the sky clean. At Victoria Station, Poirot boarded the boat train to Dover with the air of a man embarking on a pilgrimage. The Channel crossing was smooth, the French railways punctual. By late afternoon, he stood on the tarmac at Bordeaux-Mérignac, a slight figure in a camel-hair coat and Homburg hat, clutching a Malacca cane. A chauffeur in dove-grey livery approached. "Monsieur Poirot, Madame Duval's compliments. The car is this way." The vehicle was a silver Rolls-Royce Phantom Three, its lines sleek as a shark. The chauffeur held the door, and Poirot sank into the scent of polished leather and lavender. As they glided through the vineyards of Entre-deux-Mers, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. The driver said nothing, and Poirot did not press him. Silence, he had learned, was often more revealing than speech. Night fell as they turned onto a private road flanked by plane trees. The headlights swept over a wrought-iron gate, its crest matching the letterhead exactly. Beyond it, the chateau rose like a dark ship against the stars. Turrets, gables, a sweep of stone steps leading to double doors of carved oak. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting pools of trembling light. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a woman. She was tall, perhaps 60, with the posture of a duchess, and hair the colour of moonlight on steel. A black velvet gown clung to her like a second skin, and at her throat gleamed a single emerald the size of a quail's egg. Her eyes, green, sharp, amused, fixed on Poirot as he ascended the steps. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and musical, with the faintest trace of a Gascon accent. "You honour my house. Madame Duval." Poirot bowed over her hand, noting the faint tremor in her fingers. "The honour is mine, though I confess your invitation was intriguingly cryptic." A smile curved her lips. "All will be revealed in time. Come, the others arrive tomorrow. Tonight, you are my only guest." She led him through a vaulted hall where suits of armour stood sentinel, and tapestries depicted hunts long faded to ghosts. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Above the mantel hung a portrait of a man in 18th century dress, severe, hawk-nosed, the same green eyes as his descendant. "My late husband," Madame Duval said, following Poirot's gaze. "Etienne Duval. He built his fortune in cognac, lost it in women, and died behind a pair of French doors, not unlike the ones you will see tomorrow." She turned away abruptly. "But that is ancient history. You will want to refresh yourself." A maid, silent, efficient, showed Poirot to his suite on the second floor. The room was lavish. A four-poster bed draped in burgundy silk, a fireplace of carved marble, windows overlooking a terrace where moonlight silvered a balustrade. And there, at the far end, a pair of glass-panelled doors, the famous French doors no doubt, stood slightly ajar, curtains stirring in the night breeze. Poirot crossed to them. The terrace beyond was wide, paved in limestone, bordered by urns spilling ivy. Below, the gardens fell away in shadowed tiers, a maze of hedges and statues barely visible. Somewhere, an owl called. He closed the doors firmly and turned the key in the lock. a heavy, old-fashioned key that gleamed with use. As he prepared for bed, his mind churned. Madame Duval had spoken of her husband dying behind a pair of French doors. An accident, suicide, murder, and why invite a detective years later to unravel a small mystery? The phrasing nagged at him. Too casual, too deliberate. He slipped between the sheets, the mattress yielding like a cloud. Just before sleep claimed him, he heard it, a faint sound, like a footstep on the terrace outside. He sat up, heart quickening, but the room was empty, the doors still locked. Imagination, perhaps, or the first whisper of the game about to begin. Downstairs, in the library, Madame Duval stood before the fire, the invitation's duplicate in her hand. She fed it to the flames and watched the paper curl, blacken and vanish. Then she smiled, a small secret smile, and poured herself a glass of cognac from a crystal decanter. "Welcome to Château de la Mort, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured to the empty room. "Let us see how sharp those little grey cells truly are." Chapter 2. Arrival at the chateau. The morning sun rose, pale and watery over the Dordogne, gilding the mist that clung to the river like a lover reluctant to part. Hercule Poirot stood at his bedroom window, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the estate that unfolded beneath him. Château de la Mort was even more imposing by daylight. A fortress of honey-coloured stone, its slate roofs glinting, its chimneys exhaling thin plumes of smoke into the crisp air. The gardens terraced down to a formal parterre, then dissolved into a wilder landscape of topiary and gravel paths. At the far end, half hidden by yew hedges, glinted the glass roof of a conservatory. And everywhere, like punctuation marks in a Gothic sentence, stood those French doors, tall, narrow, framed in wrought iron, opening from every principal room onto balconies or terraces. Poirot dressed with his usual meticulous care. A dove-grey morning suit, a waistcoat of palest lilac, a tie pinned with a pearl the size of a pea. He smoothed his moustache with a dab of pomade, donned his Homburg, and descended the grand staircase. The house was silent save for the ticking of a long-case clock in the hall and the distant clatter of pans from the kitchens. Madame Duval, it seemed, was not an early riser. A footman in burgundy livery bowed. "Breakfast is served in the winter dining-room, monsieur. Madame will join you presently." The winter dining-room overlooked the east terrace. A table long enough for 20 was laid for 2. Sèvres porcelain, silver cutlery, heavy as weapons. A centerpiece of hothouse roses, the colour of fresh blood. Poirot took his seat, unfolded a napkin starched to cardboard stiffness, and helped himself to a croissant so buttery it left golden crescents on his fingers. The coffee was strong, the marmalade tart with Seville oranges. He was halfway through his second cup when the doors opened and Madame Duval swept in. She wore morning black again, but today it was silk, cut severe as a nun's habit, relieved only by a brooch of jet and diamonds at her throat. Her hair was pinned in an elaborate chignon. Her face, beneath a light dusting of powder, betrayed no sign of the previous night's cognac. "Bon matin, Monsieur Poirot." She extended a hand gloved in black lace. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a child in the arms of Morpheus," Poirot replied, rising to kiss the gloved fingers. "Though I confess the silence of the countryside is oppressive to one accustomed to the symphony of London traffic." She laughed, a low, throaty sound, and took her place opposite him. A maid poured coffee. Another offered œufs en cocotte, shimmering with cream and truffle. Madame Duval ate delicately, her eyes never leaving Poirot's face. "You are observant," she said at last. "That is good. Observation is the mother of deduction, is it not?" "Precisely. And I observe, madame, that your household runs with the precision of a Swiss watch. Yet there is tension beneath the surface. The footman who served me, his dexter left hand trembled as he set down the platter. The maid who poured your coffee, she glanced at the French doors 3 times in as many minutes. And you yourself," Poirot leaned forward, voice softening, "you have not once looked directly at the portrait of your late husband that hangs in the hall." Madame Duval's spoon paused halfway to her lips. For a moment, the mask slipped. Something raw and ancient flickered in her green eyes. Then it was gone. "Etienne has been dead these 15 years, she said. "One grows accustomed." "Yet one does not forget," Poirot murmured. "Especially when one invites a detective to the house where he met his end." She set the spoon down with a click. "Touché, but all in good time. Today the others arrive. You will meet them, form your impressions. Tonight we dine en famille. Tomorrow," she spread her hands, rings flashing. "Tomorrow the game begins." The first car crunched up the gravel at 11 o'clock. A scarlet Bugatti, low and predatory, driven by a young man who leapt out before the chauffeur could open the door. He was tall, sun-browned, with the restless energy of a colt. His suit was Savile Row, but the knot of his tie had already surrendered to impatience. "Madame Duval," he called, striding into the hall as though he owned it. "Still haunting this mausoleum, I see." "Julien, mon neveu," Madame Duval said coolly. "You are punctual for once. May I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot, my nephew, Julien Duval?" Julien's handshake was bone-crushing. His eyes, hazel, bloodshot, raked Poirot with frank curiosity. "The detective? Aunt Eleanor, you sly old fox. What's the game? Someone pinched the silver?" "Patience, Julien," Madame Duval said. "All will be revealed." Julien snorted, tossed his hat to the footman, and disappeared in the direction of the library, whistling. Next came a Daimler, the colour of clotted cream. From it emerged a woman in her late 30s, statuesque, with the kind of beauty that stops conversations. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, coiled beneath a veiled hat. Her coat was sable, her gloves kid. She carried a small dog, a Pomeranian with a diamante collar, that yapped incessantly until she hushed it with a single finger. "Claudine Lefebvre," Madame Duval announced, "my husband's ward, and this is Hercule Poirot." Claudine's eyes were violet, extraordinary. She extended a languid hand. "Enchanted! I have read of your exploits, monsieur. Tell me, do you always solve your cases, or do some mysteries remain deliciously unresolved?" Poirot bowed. "I find, mademoiselle, that resolution is merely a matter of asking the right questions." She smiled, showing small, sharp teeth, and glided past him, the dog trotting at her heels. The third arrival was quieter. A Morris Oxford, sensible and grey, driven by a man in his 50s with the stoop of a scholar. He wore tweeds and carried a battered briefcase bulging with papers. His handshake was dry, his eyes behind spectacles mild but keen. "Professor Armand Valois," he introduced himself. "Art historian. Madame Duval has been kind enough to allow me access to the chateau's library for my research on medieval miniatures. I hope I shan't be in the way." "On the contrary," Poirot said, "knowledge is never in the way of truth." The professor smiled faintly and was shown to his room. Lunch was served on the south terrace. Consommé madrilène, sole meunière, a salade niçoise glistening with olive oil. The French doors stood open to the garden. A breeze carried the scent of rosemary and boxwood. Julian drank too much Sancerre and argued with Claudine about inheritance taxes. Professor Valois sketched the view on the back of a menu. Madame Duval presided like a queen, her gaze flicking occasionally to the balcony beyond the doors, where, Poirot noted, a single pane of glass bore a hairline crack no one had mentioned. After lunch, Poirot requested a tour. Madame Duval obliged, leading him through salons hung with Gobelin's tapestries, a music room where a Bechstein Grand gathered dust beneath a shroud, a billiard room with cues racked like soldiers. On the first floor, a long gallery displayed family portraits. Duval's through the centuries, their faces growing progressively more haunted. The last was Etienne Duval himself, painted, Poirot calculated, shortly before his death. He stood before a pair of French doors identical to those in the dining room, one hand on the handle as though about to step outside. His expression was unreadable. "Painted by Sargent," Madame Duval said. "A wedding gift. Etienne hated it, said it made him look like a man walking to his own funeral." They descended a servant's stair to the kitchens, vast copper-clad redolent of garlic and thyme. The cook, a mountainous woman named Berthe, was jointing rabbits with a cleaver. She curtsied awkwardly when Madame Duval introduced Poirot. "Berthe has been with us since she was 14, Madame Duval said. She knew Etienne when he was a boy." Berthe's eyes, small and dark in her moon face, flicked to Poirot and away. "Poor monsieur," she muttered. "Those doors—" Madame Duval's smile tightened. "Enough, Berthe. Back to work." Outside, the afternoon had turned sultry. Poirot wandered the gardens alone. The maze was a labyrinth of yew, its paths ankle-deep in fallen leaves. At its centre stood a marble fountain, a nymph pouring water from an urn, her face eroded by centuries of rain. Poirot sat on the rim, took out his notebook, and began to sketch the layout of the chateau as he had seen it. Ground floor, hall, winter dining, salon, library, billiard room, each with French doors to the terrace. First floor, bedrooms, gallery, Madame Duval's private sitting room, again, those doors. Second floor, attics, servants' quarters. The pattern was deliberate. The Chaillot house breathed through its glass lungs. A footstep on gravel, Poirot looked up to see Julian emerging from a side path, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Lost, monsieur?" Julian asked, merely orienting myself. "And you?" Julian shrugged. "Needed air. Aunt Eleanor's hospitality is stifling." He flicked ash into the fountain. "Look here, Poirot. What's this all about? She's got some bee in her bonnet about Uncle Etienne's death, hasn't she? Been 15 years. Accident, pure and simple. Fell from the balcony after too much brandy. Why drag it up now?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps because accidents, mon ami, are sometimes not accidents at all." Julian stared, then laughed shortly. "You're as mad as she is. Well, good luck. Just don't expect the rest of us to play along." He ground the cigarette beneath his heel and strode away. Dusk fell early, the sky bruising to violet. Poirot returned to the house to find the great chandelier in the hall ablaze, casting prisms across the marble floor. The guests assembled for aperitifs, Julian sulking with a whiskey, Claudine sipping champagne and feeding caviar to her dog, Professor Valois nursing a glass of sherry and examining a medieval manuscript he had unearthed from the library. Madame Duval entered last, now in crimson velvet that made her skin luminous. "Dinner is served," she announced. They processed into the winter dining room, where the table had been extended and laid with crystal that chimed like bells. The French doors stood closed against the night, curtains drawn. but Poirot could feel the balcony beyond like a presence at his back. Candles flickered, shadows danced on the walls. The first course, foie gras with fig compote, was halfway consumed when the lights flickered. A collective gasp. For a heartbeat, the room plunged into darkness. Then the chandelier steadied, but not before Poirot caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the glass doors. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing just outside. When the meal resumed, conversation was subdued. Claudine's dog began to whine. Professor Valois cleared his throat. "Madame, if I may, the manuscript I examined today, it contains a curious marginalium. A Duval ancestor, writing in 1789, speaks of the doors that open both ways. Do you know the reference?" Madame Duval's fork paused. "Old family superstition. The French doors were installed in the 1750s by an ancestor obsessed with symmetry. He believed they allowed the soul to pass freely between house and garden, life and death. Nonsense, of course." Julian drained his glass. "Everything in this house is nonsense, including us." Dessert, tarte tatin with crème anglaise, was served in near silence. As coffee was poured, Madame Duval rose. "My friends," she said, "tomorrow we begin in earnest. Monsieur Poirot has agreed to help me lay a ghost to rest. 15 years ago, my husband died on the balcony beyond. These doors. The coroner said accident. I say otherwise. Tonight, sleep well. Tomorrow, the past returns." She pulled a silken cord. The curtains swept back, revealing the French doors, and beyond them, the balcony where Etienne Duval had fallen. The glass was misted with condensation, but for a moment Poirot could have sworn he saw a handprint, pale and perfect, pressed against the pane from the outside. Then the lights dimmed for the night, and the guests dispersed to their rooms, each carrying the weight of unspoken questions. Poirot lingered last, staring at the doors. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 10. He touched the glass, cold as a tombstone, and felt the faint vibration of a presence that had not yet revealed itself. In his bedroom, he locked the French doors, drew the curtains, and set his revolver, retrieved after all from his luggage, on the nightstand. Then he sat in an armchair, fully dressed, and waited for the chateau to speak. It did not take long. At 11:30, a floorboard creaked in the corridor. Soft footsteps passed his door, paused, moved on. Poirot rose silently, pressed his ear to the wood. Nothing. He opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty, but at the far end, where the gallery met the main staircase, a sliver of light showed beneath a door he had not noticed before. He slipped into the corridor, shoes in hand. The carpet swallowed his footsteps. The door led to a small anteroom lined with mirrors, distorting, unnerving. Beyond it, another door, this one ajar. Voices drifted through. "Can't go on like this, Eleanor. If he finds out—" "Silence, Julian. He suspects nothing yet." Poirot froze. Madame Duval and her nephew, arguing in whispers. He strained to hear more, but a sudden gust of wind rattled the French doors at the end of the hall, and the voices cut off. When he reached the anteroom, it was empty, the inner door closed. He tried the handle, locked. Back in his room, Poirot sat until dawn, the revolver across his knee, turning the day's impressions like pieces of a puzzle. The cracked pane, the handprint, the professor's manuscript, Julian's anger, Claudine's violet eyes. And always, always those doors, opening both ways. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the gardens in stark autumn clarity. Somewhere in the maze, a peacock screamed. Poirot closed his eyes and for the first time in years felt the thrill of a hunt truly begun. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Hallways. The chateau woke slowly as though reluctant to face the day. Hercule Poirot descended at 8:30, immaculate in a three-piece suit of midnight blue, his cane tapping a measured rhythm on the marble stairs. The great hall smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. A maid in a starched apron was polishing the banister with slow, circular strokes. She did not look up as Poirot passed, but he noted the tremor in her wrist, the way her cloth lingered over the same spot again and again. In short, the winter dining room. Breakfast was laid buffet-style on a mahogany sideboard. Silver chafing dishes of scrambled eggs flecked with chives, rashers of bacon curled like rose petals, kippers glistening in butter, a pyramid of brioche still warm from the oven. A samovar hissed gently, releasing clouds of lapsang souchong. Only Professor Valois was present, spectacles perched on his forehead, buttering toast with scholarly precision. "Bon matin, monsieur," Poirot greeted him. "You are an early riser." "Old habits?" the professor replied, smiling shyly. "The library here is a treasure trove. I was up until 3 cataloguing a Psalter from 1342. Illuminated borders, exquisite. The Duvals were patrons of the Limoges school, you know." Poirot helped himself to eggs and a single perfect sausage. "And the marginalia you mentioned last night. The doors that open both ways. Did you find more?" Valois glanced over his shoulder, though the room was empty. "Curious phrase, isn't it? I found a second reference in a household inventory from 1756. The master of the house, another Etienne, incidentally, ordered 12 portes françaises à double battant, ferrures en forme de corbeau. 12 French doors with double leaves, ironwork shaped like ravens, the family crest, of course. But the note adds, pour que les âmes errantes ne soient point emprisonnées, so that wandering souls might not be imprisoned. He spread jam with unnecessary care. Superstition, naturally, but persistent. Poirot's moustache twitched. Superstition is often the husk in which truth hides. Footsteps in the corridor announced Claudine Lefebvre. She wore a dressing gown of peach silk that clung like mist, her hair loose and shining. The Pomeranian trotted at her heels, collar tinkling. "Coffee," she declared tragically, "is the only civilized way to begin a day that promises to be intolerable." She poured from the samovar, added 3 sugars, and sank into a chair. "Tell me, Professor, have you unearthed any scandalous love letters? The Duvals must have had their share." Valois flushed. "Nothing so piquant, mademoiselle, though there is a curious gap in the correspondence between 1919 and 1923. Etienne Duval, the current Madame's husband, was abroad then. Indochina, I believe." Claudine's violet eyes gleamed. "How mysterious! Perhaps he was running from a crime passionnel." "Or toward a fortune," Poirot murmured. Julien Duval entered next, unshaven, tie askew, smelling faintly of last night's whiskey. He loaded a plate with bacon and eggs, slathered everything in HP sauce, and ate standing up. "Morning all," he grunted. "Aunt Eleanor still abed? Typical. Leaves the rest of us to twiddle our thumbs until she deigns to play hostess." "Patience, mon neveu," came Madame Duval's voice from the doorway. She was dressed for riding, black jacket, white breeches, boots polished to Vickers mirrors, and carried a crop that she tapped against her thigh. "Some of us have estate business before breakfast. The tenants wait for no one, not even ghosts." Julien snorted. "Tenants, that's rich. Half the vineyards are leased to cooperatives now. You're presiding over a museum, aunt. Enough." The single word cracked like the crop. Julien subsided, scowling. Madame Duval turned to Poirot. "Monsieur, after breakfast, I thought you might care to see the West Wing. It has been closed since Etienne's death. The balcony where he fell is there." Poirot inclined his head. "I am at your disposal." The west wing was reached by a corridor, panelled in dark oak, its air thick with the scent of disuse. Dust sheets shrouded furniture like mourning veils. Cobwebs laced the cornices. Their footsteps echoed. At the far end, a pair of French doors, taller than the others, their glass filmed with grime, stood sentinel. Madame Duval produced a key from her pocket, heavy and black with age. "The lock sticks," she said, wrestling with it. "No one has entered since the inquest." The doors groaned open onto a balcony of weathered stone. Below, the garden fell away in steep terraces to a dried-up fountain choked with ivy. The balustrade was cracked. One section had been crudely repaired with newer stone. Poirot stepped forward, cane probing the floorboards. They were solid, but he noted a darker patch near the edge. Perhaps a stain, perhaps only shadow. "Here," Madame Duval said quietly. He was found at dawn by the undergardener, sprawled on the path below, neck broken, brandy on his breath. The coroner said he leaned too far, lost his balance. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles whitened on the crop. Etienne was not a drunkard, and he was not suicidal. Poirot knelt, examining the repaired balustrade. The mortar was fresh, within the last year, he judged. Who ordered the repair? The estate manager said it was unsafe. She hesitated. "I did not argue." Inside the room, a study by the look of it, books lay scattered as though abandoned mid-read. A leather-topped desk bore a green-shaded lamp, its cord frayed. Poirot opened drawers. Stationery, a pipe, a photograph of a younger Madame Duval, radiant in pearls. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, he found a small ledger bound in red morocco. The last entry, dated 3 days before Etienne's death, read, "C demands settlement. Refuse again and consequences." The initial was in Etienne's bold hand. Poirot pocketed the ledger discreetly. "You kept this room exactly as it was?" "Until today. I thought you might see something the police missed." They returned to the main house in silence. In the hall, Bertha the cook was supervising the laying of luncheon tables. She dropped a curtsy as they passed, but Poirot caught her staring at Madame Duval with an expression that might have been fear or hatred. Luncheon was served in the summer dining room. Its French doors opened to a terrace where bees droned in lavender. The menu was light: cold consommé, trout with almonds, a peach sorbet sharp with kirsch. Conversation was desultory until Claudine, toying with her sorbet spoon, said lazily, "I dreamed last night of doors opening and closing by themselves. Most unsettling. Do you suppose the chateau is haunted, madame?" Julian laughed. "Only by unpaid bills and bad temper." Professor Valois cleared his throat. "In medieval times, doorways were liminal spaces, neither inside nor out. Thresholds where the veil between worlds thinned." "Spare us the lecture, Professor," Julian snapped. "We're not here for a seminar." Madame Duval's eyes flashed. "We are here because I wish it, and because Monsieur Poirot has agreed to help me discover the truth about my husband's death. If any of you object, the gate is open." Silence fell. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun. The terrace darkened. After lunch, Poirot sought solitude in the library. It was a cavernous room, 2 stories high, reached by a wrought-iron spiral stair. Sunlight slanted through dusty windows, illuminating shelves of calf-bound volumes. He climbed to the upper gallery, where the air smelled of vellum and candle smoke. Here were the rare books, incunabula, manuscripts in iron chests. He was examining a book of hours when he heard voices below. Julian and Claudine, arguing in whispers. "Can't keep avoiding it," Julian hissed. "If she digs too deep, let her dig," Claudine replied, voice like silk over steel. "Some secrets are better buried. Besides, the little Belgian is harmless, all moustache and no teeth." Poirot smiled grimly. He descended softly, but by the time he reached the lower level, the room was empty save for the echo of a slammed door. Tea was served at 4 in the small salon. Darjeeling, scones with clotted cream, tiny sandwiches of cucumber, and smoked salmon. Madame Duval presided in a gown of moss-green velvet. The Pomeranian begged shamelessly until Claudine fed it a scone, earning a reproving glance from the professor. Poirot sipped his tea and observed. Julian was restless, checking his watch every few minutes. Claudine painted her nails scarlet, the brush moving with hypnotic precision. Professor Valois had brought a folio of sketches, plans of the chateau, annotated in his neat hand. Poirot leaned closer. "These are excellent," he said. "You have marked every set of French doors." Valois nodded. 12, as the inventory stated, though one pair, here in the old nursery, was bricked up in 1890 after a child fell. The others remain. "And the balcony where Monsieur Duval died?" "Directly accessible from the west study, the master bedroom above, and—" Valois hesitated, a servant's stair at the rear, rarely used now. Madame Duval set down her cup. "Tonight, after dinner, we will hold a small experiment. Monsieur Poirot has suggested we recreate Etienne's last evening. Julian, you will play my husband. The rest of us will be ourselves. We begin at 9 o'clock in the west study." Julian's face darkened. "This is absurd." "Nevertheless," Madame Duval said softly, "you will participate, or you may pack your bags." The afternoon dissolved into a strange torpor. Poirot walked the gardens again, noting the position of the west balcony relative to the dried fountain. From the path below, the drop was perhaps 20 feet. Enough to kill, but not inevitably. He found scuff marks on the stone coping, as though someone had recently climbed up or down. Nearby, half buried in ivy, lay a brass button engraved with a tiny raven. He pocketed it. At 6 he retired to dress for dinner. In his room, he found his bed turned down. A hot water bottle nestled between the sheets. On the pillow lay a single white feather. He examined it under his magnifying glass. Goose down, common enough, but the quill had been cut cleanly with a sharp blade. A message? A threat? He locked it in his travelling case beside the red ledger. Dinner was formal, 7 courses, beginning with caviar and ending with soufflé Rothschild. The great chandelier blazed, the French doors to the terrace stood open, admitting a chill breeze that made the candles gutter. Conversation was brittle. Julian drank steadily. Claudine flirted with the professor, who blushed to the roots of his hair. Madame Duval watched them all with the stillness of a cat at a mousehole. At 9 precisely, they adjourned to the west study. The room had been prepared. Brandy decanter on the desk, a single lamp casting long shadows. The French doors were locked, curtains drawn. Julian, sullen in evening dress, took his place by the balcony. Etienne would have poured a nightcap, Madame Duval instructed, then stepped outside for air. Julian obeyed, splashing brandy into a glass. He raised it in mock toast. "To absent friends?" He drank, grimaced, and moved to the doors. Madame Duval unlocked them with the same heavy key. Julian stepped onto the balcony, the night swallowing him. For a long moment, nothing. Then a cry, sharp, cut off. The guests rushed forward. Julian lay sprawled on the balcony floor, glass shattered beside him, brandy soaking the stone. But he was laughing, a harsh, drunken sound. "Fooled you," he gasped, sitting up. "Just a bit of theatre, see? No ghosts." Madame Duval's face was white. "You fool! You could have fallen." "But I didn't." Julian lurched to his feet. "Experiment over. I'm for bed." He pushed past them, leaving wet footprints. Poirot knelt by the spilled brandy. The scent was sharp, but beneath it, something else. Bitter almonds? He touched a finger to the liquid, tasted cautiously. Not cyanide, but close. Aconite, perhaps. Enough to fell a man if ingested in quantity. He straightened. "Madame, your nephew is reckless. But someone here is more than reckless. Someone is deadly serious." In the corridor outside, a floorboard creaked. Poirot whirled, but the hallway was empty. Only the French doors at the far end stood ajar, curtains stirring like restless ghosts. Later, in his room, Poirot sat by the fire with his notebook. He listed the day's discoveries. The repaired balustrade, the red ledger, C demand settlement, the brass raven button, the cut goose feather, the drugged brandy. And beneath, in violet ink, "Who is C?" He locked his door, wedged a chair beneath the handle, and placed his revolver on the nightstand. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the French doors like bones in a box. Somewhere in the chateau, a clock chimed midnight. Poirot closed his eyes and listened to the house breathe. In the west wing, Madame Duval stood alone on the balcony where her husband had died. She held Julian's shattered glass, turning it in the moonlight. A single drop of brandy trembled on the rim, then fell, plop, onto the stone below. She watched it spread, dark as blood, and whispered to the night, "Come, Etienne. The doors are open both ways. It is time." Chapter 4. The Lavish Dinner Party. The great dining room of Château de la Mort had never looked more splendid, nor more perilous. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering prisms across the long table set for 8. Silver epergons overflowed with orchids the colour of bruises. Candelabra flickered like watchful eyes. The French doors stood open to the terrace, admitting a warm, resin-scented breeze that carried the low thrum of cicadas. Beyond the balustrade, the gardens dissolved into velvet darkness, the moon a thin silver blade above the maze. Hercule Poirot entered precisely at 8, resplendent in white tie and tails, the Order of Leopold gleaming at his lapel. His patent shoes reflected the candlelight. His moustache was waxed to twin points of perfection. He paused on the threshold, surveying the scene with the satisfaction of a conductor before the orchestra strikes its first note. Madame Duval presided at the head of the table in a gown of midnight blue satin, diamonds flashing at her throat like captive stars. To her right sat Claudine Lefebvre, ravishing in emerald silk that left her shoulders bare. The Pomeranian, banished to a velvet cushion, whimpered softly. Professor Valois, opposite Claudine, had exchanged his tweeds for a dinner jacket that strained at the seams. His spectacles glinted nervously. Julian Duval lounged at the foot, already flushed with pre-dinner whiskey, his bow tie askew. 2 places remained empty, one for the mysterious 8th guest, one for Poirot himself. "Bonsoir, mes amis," Madame Duval greeted. "Tonight we dine as my husband did on his last evening. Every detail will be exact. Bertha has outdone herself." As if summoned, the cook appeared with her brigade. White-aproned footmen bearing domed silver trays. The first course was announced with a Béarn flourish. Consommé Olga, clear as topaz, garnished with slivers of truffle that floated like black petals. The wine was a 1921 Château d'Yquem, poured with reverence. Poirot sipped, savouring the honeyed complexity. "Magnifique! Your cellar, madame, is a national treasure." Madame Duval inclined her head. Etienne laid it down. He believed great wine was the only immortality a man could buy. Julian snorted. He bought plenty then. Pity he didn't live to drink it. Claudine's laugh was silver bells. Darling Julian, must you be so morbid? We are here to celebrate memory, not bury it. The second course arrived. Filets de sole Walewska, the fish nestled in a sauce of lobster and cream, crowned with a single crayfish tail. Conversation flowed, light, brittle, dangerous. Professor Valois spoke of a newly discovered manuscript that mentioned a Duval ancestor executed for poisoning his wife with nightshade. Claudine recounted a scandalous weekend in Deauville involving a prince and a ballerina. Julian drank steadily, his eyes fixed on the French doors as though expecting a spectre to materialize. Poirot observed. The footman serving Claudine, young, dark, with a scar across one knuckle, poured her wine with a tremor that sent a drop cascading down the crystal stem. She smiled up at him, slow and deliberate, and the boy flushed crimson. Madame Duval's gaze flicked to the exchange, sharp as a stiletto. The third course was Tornados Rossini, the beef rare and glistening, perched atop foie gras and black truffle, bathed in a reduction of Madeira. The wine shifted to a 1918 Latour, its cork drawn with a soft sigh. Julian raised his glass. To Uncle Etienne, he toasted, voice slurred, who fell farther than any of us imagined. Glasses clinked. Poirot noted that Madame Duval's hand shook as she drank. A single drop of wine stained her lip like blood. She dabbed it away with a napkin monogrammed ED. Between courses, the orchestra, hidden behind a screen of potted palms, struck up a waltz. The music was the Blue Danube, languid and mocking. Claudine rose, extending a hand to Professor Valois. Dance with me, cher professeur. You cannot spend your life among dusty books. Valois protested weakly, but allowed himself to be led to the parquet floor beyond the table. They moved stiffly at first, then with surprising grace. Julian watched, scowling, then turned to Poirot. Tell me, detective, do you dance, or do you only interrogate? I do both, Poirot replied equably. Though I prefer the tango. It is a dance of precision and passion, much like detection. Madame Duval signalled. The footman cleared plates. The next course arrived. Selle d'agneau à la boulangère, lamb roasted with potatoes and onions, fragrant with rosemary. The wine was a 1929 Margaux, velvet on the tongue. Conversation turned to inheritance. The estate is entailed, Madame Duval said, cutting her lamb with surgical grace. Etienne's will was complicated. Julian stands to inherit the vineyards, but only if certain conditions are met. Julian's knife screeched across porcelain. Conditions written by a madman. I have to reside here 6 months of the year. This mausoleum, I'd rather burn it. Claudine leaned forward, décolletage gleaming. But think of the parties, chérie. Imagine the scandal if you turned the West Wing into a casino. Professor Valois returned to his seat, flushed. The acoustics in this room are remarkable. The music seems to come from the walls themselves. Poirot's ears pricked. He had noticed it too, the way sound carried, distorted, through the high ceilings and open doors. A whisper in the corridor could reach the table as clearly as a shout. The fifth course was sorbet au citron in chilled silver cups, sharp and cleansing. Then the pinnacle, poularde truffée demi-deuil, a capon stuffed with truffles, its skin lacquered gold, served with a sauce of morel mushrooms and cream. The wine was a 1900 Chateau Lafite, decanted with ceremony. Poirot inhaled its bouquet, violets, cedar, a whisper of earth, and felt the centuries in every sip. Julian was now openly drunk, his voice rising, To hell with conditions. I'll sell the whole damn place to the first American who offers. Turn it into a hotel. Murder manor. Stay where the master fell. Madame Duval's face was stone. You will do no such thing, won't I? Julian lurched to his feet, swaying. Watch me. He staggered toward the French doors, flung them wider. The night rushed in, cool, scented with jasmine and something metallic. Moonlight silvered the balcony where Etienne had died. Julian stepped out, arms spread like a crucified saint. See, nothing to fear, just air, just... His foot slipped on a loose tile. He windmilled, caught the balustrade, and for a heartbeat teetered on the edge. Claudine screamed. Professor Valois started forward. Poirot was already moving, cane tapping frantically. Julian righted himself, laughing maniacally. Fooled you again! Christ, you should see your faces! He stumbled back inside, collapsing into his chair. The orchestra, unnerved, faltered into silence. Madame Duval rose, trembling with rage. Enough! You disgrace this house! Julian's laughter died. Disgrace? This house is a graveyard. And you, he pointed a shaking finger, you keep digging up the corpses. The dessert course arrived unheeded. Millefeuille layered with vanilla cream and raspberries, accompanied by a 1893 Tokaji Essentia, so rare, the sommelier wept as he poured it. No one ate. The tension was a living thing, coiled around the table. Poirot broke the silence. Madame, you said every detail would be exact. On the night Monsieur Duval died, who was present? Madame Duval's voice was ice. Myself. Julian, though he was only 20. Claudine, newly arrived from Paris. The professor was not yet in Neo. Residence, and, she hesitated, a guest, Monsieur Charles Beaumont, Etienne's business partner. He left for Bordeaux that night, never returned. Julian's head snapped up. Beaumont, that bastard, he's the one who... Silence! Madame Duval's hand slammed the table. Crystal jumped. Charles is dead, died in Indochina, 1923, you know this. Do I? Julian's eyes were wild. Convenient, isn't it? Everyone who crosses you ends up dead. Claudine's laugh was brittle. Careful, Julian. You sound like a man with a guilty conscience. The orchestra struck up again. Softer now. Clair de Lune. The footman served coffee in porcelain cups painted with ravens. Poirot declined sugar, watching the steam curl like ghosts. At 11, Madame Duval rose. The recreation is complete. Etienne would have retired to the West Study for a final brandy. Julian, you will accompany Monsieur Poirot. The rest of us will wait here. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but something in his aunt's gaze silenced him. He followed Poirot from the room, weaving slightly. The corridor was dim, lit only by sconces that guttered in the draught from the open doors. In the West Study, the scene was set. Decanter, single glass, the French doors locked as they had been 15 years ago. Julian poured with exaggerated care, brandy glugging thickly. To the past, he toasted and drank deeply. His eyes watered. God, that's strong. Poirot watched motionless. Tell me, monsieur, on the night your uncle died, where were you? Julian wiped his mouth. In bed, drunk like tonight. Aunt Eleanor found me at dawn, retching in the rose garden. I didn't hear a thing. And Mademoiselle Claudine? Flirting with the stable boy, probably. She was always... He stopped, swaying. Christ, my head. He staggered to the French doors, fumbled with the key. Poirot stepped forward, but Julian waved him off. Need air. Just air. He unlocked the doors, stepped onto the balcony. The night was ink-black, the moon hidden by clouds. For a moment, Julian stood silhouetted against the void. Then he leaned over the balustrade, retching violently. Poirot moved to his side, cane ready. Monsieur, You are unwell. Let me. Julian straightened, face ghastly. Poison, he whispered. The brandy. Tastes like last time. He collapsed. Poirot caught him, lowering him to the stone floor. The glass had fallen, shattering into 1,000 shards that glittered like frost. Poirot sniffed the remnants. Bitter almonds, unmistakable now. Cyanide. Footsteps pounded in the corridor. Madame Duval burst in, followed by Claudine and Valois. The professor carried a small black bag, his medical kit apparently. "He's been poisoned!" Claudine cried. Valois knelt, fingers at Julian's neck. "Pulse thready, pupils dilated. We need an antidote. Potassium ferricyanide, or—" "Too late," Poirot said, grimly. "The dose was massive. He will not survive the night." Madame Duval stood frozen, staring at her nephew's convulsing form. Then, slowly, she turned to the shattered glass. Among the fragments lay a small white pill, half dissolved. "Digitalis," Valois murmured, "from my bag. I keep it for my heart. Someone substituted it for the cyanide capsule." Claudine's hand flew to her mouth. "But who—" Poirot's voice cut like a blade. "Who had access to the decanter? Who knew the exact recreation would include this brandy, this glass, this room?" He strode to the French doors, examining the lock. Fresh scratches marred the brass. Someone had forced it recently. On the balcony floor, beneath Julian's outstretched hand, lay a single white feather, its quill cut clean. Madame Duval sank to her knees beside her nephew. "Julian," she whispered, "Mon Dieu, what have I done?" Julian's eyes fluttered open. "Aunt, the doors. He's here, behind the doors." His gaze fixed on the glass panes, where moonlight now revealed a handprint, pale, perfect, pressed from the inside. Then his body arched, a final spasm, and he was still. Poirot closed the young man's eyes with gentle fingers. "The game, mes amis, has become deadly earnest. Someone in this house intended Julian Duval to die tonight, exactly as his uncle died 15 years ago, and they have succeeded." In the dining room, the orchestra played on, oblivious. Claire de Lune drifted through the open doors, sweet and mocking, as the chateau's shadows lengthened and the French doors stood wide to the night. Chapter 5. The Shadow Behind the Doors. The scream that tore through Château de la Mort at 2:30 in the morning was not human. It was the sound of a soul being flayed. Poirot was already awake, sitting fully dressed in the wing-back chair beside his bedroom fire, revolver across his knee. He had not slept since Julian's body was carried to the old nursery on the second floor, and laid beneath a sheet that smelled of mothballs and lavender water. The house had settled into a brittle silence, broken only by the wind prowling the corridors like a restless animal. When the scream came again, higher, shredded, Poirot was on his feet, cane in one hand, pistol in the other. He flung open his door. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness, lit only by a single sconce guttering at the far end. Another scream, closer now, and the crash of breaking glass. It came from the west wing. Poirot ran. His slippers whispered over the runner. His shadow leapt ahead of him, distorted by the flickering flame. Behind him, doors opened. Claudine in a silk wrapper, hair wild, Professor Valois clutching a candlestick, Madame Duval, face chalk white beneath her cold cream, a dressing gown clutched to her throat. "The study!" she gasped. "The French doors!" They reached the west wing together. The study door stood ajar, a wedge of moonlight spilling across the threshold like spilled milk. Inside, chaos. The desk lamp overturned, papers scattered, the brandy decanter shattered. And on the balcony, silhouetted against the night sky, a figure in black, tall, hooded, faceless, stood with arms raised as though in invocation, For one frozen heartbeat, Poirot saw it clearly. The cloak billowing, the gloved hands clutching something that glinted. Then the figure whirled, vaulted the balustrade, and vanished into the darkness below. Claudine screamed again. Valois dropped the candlestick. Wax hissed on the parquet. Madame Duval pushed past them, running to the French doors. "Julian!" she cried, though Julian lay cold upstairs. "Etienne!" Poirot reached the balcony in 3 strides. The night air was sharp with frost, his breath plumed. Below, the garden was a black sea of shadows, but he heard the crunch of gravel, the snap of a twig, someone running. He raised the revolver sighted along the barrel, but the figure was already swallowed by the maze. "Mon Dieu!" Valois whispered behind him. "A ghost." "Not a ghost," Poirot said grimly. "A man, or a woman, in a cloak, and very much alive." He knelt, examining the balcony floor. The tiles were wet, not with dew, but with brandy from the shattered decanter. Footprints led from the study to the balustrade. Large, booted, the tread of a man. But beside them, smaller prints, bare feet, delicate, the toes splayed as though the person had been running in panic. And there, caught on a splinter of wood, a scrap of black silk. Claudine was trembling. I saw it from my window. A shadow, moving across the terrace. I thought it was Julian's ghost come back to punish us. Madame Duval stood rigid, staring at the spot where the figure had vanished. "Etienne wore a cloak like that," she said, voice hollow. "On the night he died. I burned it after the funeral, or thought I did." Poirot's mind raced. The cloak, the footprints, the timing. Someone had staged a spectral visitation to terrify the household. But why now? Hours after Julian's death? To cover another crime? Or to drive someone to confession? He turned back to the study. The chaos was deliberate. Drawers yanked open, books flung, the safe in the wall hanging ajar. Papers littered the floor. Bills, letters, a photograph of Etienne Duval with a younger man, both smiling in front of a vineyard. The younger man's face had been scratched out with a knife. Valois picked up a document. "This is the revised will, dated 3 days before Etienne's death. It disinherits Julian entirely, leaves everything to Claudine." Claudine gasped. "That's impossible. I never—" "But someone believed you did," Poirot said. "Someone who poisoned Julian tonight to prevent the will being contested." Madame Duval's eyes blazed. "Charles Beaumont! He drafted the will. He was here that night. He swore Etienne changed it in a fit of rage after Goulian crashed the rolls." "Beaumont is dead," Valois reminded her. "Dead men do not wear cloaks," Poirot said softly, "nor do they leave footprints." Dawn found the household gathered in the winter dining room, hollow-eyed and unshaven. Berthe had produced coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and brioche that no one touched. Julian's body lay in the nursery under a police sheet. Poirot had telephoned the gendarmerie at first light, but the nearest inspector was in Périgueux, 2 hours away. The chateau was isolated, the phone lines conveniently cut by the storm that had blown in with the false dawn. Poirot stood at the head of the table, revolver holstered now but within reach. "We are trapped here, mes amis, with a murderer who strikes in the dark and vanishes like smoke. Until the police arrive, I am in charge. No one leaves this room without my permission." Claudine's hands shook as she lit a cigarette. "You think one of us is the killer?" "I think," Poirot said, "that someone in this house knows more than they have admitted, and someone else is desperate to silence them." He laid his evidence on the table. The scrap of black silk, the brass raven button from the garden, the cut goose feather, the red ledger with its cryptic C. demands settlement. And now, the scratched photograph and the revised will. Madame Duval stared at the photograph. That's Charles Beaumont, the man I thought dead. Valois adjusted his spectacles. There's a discrepancy. The Indochina death certificate lists a Charles Beaumont, age 42, died of fever, but Etienne's partner was 37 in 1923, and the photograph, he held it to the light. The man's left hand has 6 fingers. Polydactyly, rare. The death certificate mentions no such deformity. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then Charles Beaumont may yet live, and if he lives, he may be here. A silence fell, broken only by the wind rattling the French doors. Outside the storm had broken. Rain lashed the terrace in silver sheets. The garden was a blur of grey and green, the maze a sodden labyrinth. Claudine stubbed out her cigarette. I remember Charles. Charming, ruthless. He and Etienne fought the night he died, over money, over me. Her voice cracked. Etienne accused him of forging the will. Charles laughed, said Etienne would be dead before he could prove it. Madame Duval's face was a mask, and the next morning Etienne was dead. Poirot paced. Let us reconstruct. 15 years ago. Etienne argues with Beaumont, threatens to expose him. Beaumont, or someone, poisons Etienne's brandy, pushes him from the balcony. The perfect accident. But the will is changed. Claudine inherits, Julien is disinherited. Beaumont disappears, presumed dead. Then, 15 years later, Madame Duval invites me to investigate. Why now? Madame Duval's voice was barely audible. Because I received a letter, 3 months ago, from Charles. He claimed Etienne's death was murder, and that he had proof. He demanded money to keep silent. I refused. Then Julien began receiving threats. I thought if I brought you here, the truth would protect us. Poirot stopped pacing, and instead it killed Julien. The French doors burst open with a gust of wind and rain. A figure stumbled in, sodden, mud-streaked, cloaked in black. The hood fell back, revealing a man's face, gaunt, bearded, eyes wild with terror. "Sanctuary!" he gasped, collapsing to his knees. "They're after me, the shadows behind the doors." Valois started forward, but Poirot's hand restrained him. The man's left hand clutched the cloak, 6 fingers, the extra one small and twisted. "Charles Beaumont," Poirot said quietly. "You are under arrest for the murder of Julien Duval." Beaumont laughed, a broken sound. "Murder? I'm the one they're trying to kill. I came back to warn you. Etienne's killer is still here, and they know I know." He fumbled in his pocket, drew out a sodden envelope. Proof, the real will. Etienne never changed it. Someone forged his signature after death. Madame Duval took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a document, water-stained but legible. Etienne's original will, leaving everything to Julien, with a codicil appointing Madame Duval as trustee until he reached 30. Then the will Valois found, Claudine began. "A forgery," Poirot finished, "planted tonight to cast suspicion on Mademoiselle Lefebvre." Beaumont was shivering violently. "I've been hiding in the maze since dusk. Someone in a cloak, same as mine, tried to push me from the balcony. I fought free, ran. They've been hunting me through the gardens." Poirot's mind whirled. 2 cloaked figures? Or one, changing roles like an actor? He turned to the French doors. Rain had washed the balcony clean, but in the study the footprints remained, large boots and bare feet. "The bare feet," he murmured. "Someone who removed their shoes to move silently. Someone who knows this house intimately." Bertha the cook appeared in the doorway, apron clutched in her hands. "Madam," she whispered, The nursery, the sheet, it's gone, and the window's open." They ran. The nursery was on the second floor, at the end of the west wing. The door stood wide. The sheet that had covered Julian lay in a heap. The window was indeed open, rain puddling on the sill. And on the floor, in the dust, a single bare footprint, small, delicate, leading toward the servant's stair. Poirot knelt. "Berthe," he said gently, "you knew Etienne as a boy. You loved him, perhaps?" The cook's eyes filled with tears. "He was kind to me, always. When the others mocked my size, my face, he gave me dignity. After he died, I kept his room as it was. I burned the cloak, yes, but I kept one scrap, for memory. And tonight," Poirot pressed. Berthe's voice broke. "I heard noises, went to check, saw the sheet moving, like a ghost. I screamed. When I looked again, it was gone." Claudine was pale. "Julian's body. Someone took it?" "Or it was never dead," Poirot said slowly. "Digitalis slows the heart to near stopping. A medical man might mistake it for death. Professor Valois, you pronounced him dead. But did you check for a pulse after the convulsions ceased?" Valois' face drained of colour. The cyanide odour was so strong, I assumed a crash from below." They raced downstairs to find the front doors flung wide, rain sweeping in. On the gravel drive, tyre tracks led away into the storm, deep, fresh, made by a heavy vehicle. "Someone has taken the body," Madame Duval said, "and Beaumont was gone." The black cloak lay in a sodden heap where he had fallen, but the man himself had vanished. Poirot stood in the doorway, rain lashing his face. "The shadow behind the doors," he said. "It was never a ghost. It was a lure to draw us here, to separate us. While we chased phantoms, the real killer escaped with Julian's body and the proof." He turned back to the group, eyes blazing. "But they have made one mistake. They think Hercule Poirot is distracted by shadows. They are wrong. The game is not over. It has only begun." Outside, thunder rolled across the Dordogne like the laughter of gods. The French doors slammed shut in the wind, glass rattling in their frames. And somewhere in the storm, a car engine faded into the distance, carrying away the dead or the living and the secret of Château de la Mort. Chapter 6. Interrogations and Alibis. The storm had passed by 7, leaving the chateau dripping and shivering under a sky the colour of wet slate. Hercule Poirot stood in the winter dining room, now transformed into a makeshift tribunal. The long table had been cleared of breakfast. In its place lay his evidence arrayed like a general's battle map. The scrap of black silk, the brass raven button, the cut goose feather, the red ledger, the forged will, the water-stained original will, and, newly added, a single muddy boot print lifted from the west study floor on a sheet of blotting paper. The French doors were locked and bolted. Rain still streaked the glass in silver runnels. Poirot faced his suspects. Madame Duval sat at the far end, spine straight as a ramrod, hands folded in her lap like a penitent. Claudine Lefebvre chain-smoked Turkish cigarettes, the Pomeranian asleep on her knee. Professor Valois polished his spectacles with a trembling handkerchief. Berthe the cook hovered by the service door, apron twisted in her fists. Charles Beaumont, alive, unshaven, wrapped in a blanket, occupied a chair near the fire, guarded by a footman Poirot had pressed into service. The household staff had been dismissed to the kitchens. The telephone lines remained dead. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, voice crisp as frost, "we are prisoners of circumstance until the gendarmerie arrives. A man was poisoned last night, Julian Duval. A body vanished. A cloaked figure appeared and disappeared. Proof was planted and proof was stolen. Someone in this room knows the truth. Today we will find it. He began with Madame Duval. You summoned me here to investigate your husband's death 15 years ago. Yet within 24 hours, your nephew is murdered in the same manner. Why? Madame Duval's green eyes were steady. I told you, Charles's letter. He claimed Etienne was pushed, not drunk. He demanded 50,000 francs to keep silent. I refused. I thought if the great Hercule Poirot exposed the truth, the blackmail would end. And Julian's threats? Anonymous notes. Stop digging or join your uncle. I showed them to no one. I thought they were from Charles. Poirot produced the red ledger. This was in Etienne's desk. C demands settlement. Your initial. Claudine, Madame Duval said without hesitation. Etienne believed she was his mistress. He was wrong. She was Charles. Claudine exhaled smoke. Lies. Etienne pursued me. I refused him. Charles was convenient. Poirot turned to her. Mademoiselle, you inherit everything under the forged will. You were in the dining room when Julian drank the poisoned brandy. Yet you claim to have seen nothing? I was watching the orchestra, Claudine said. Julian was alive when he left with you. Ask the professor. Valois nodded. He was. I checked his pulse after the convulsions. It was faint but present. I made a mistake. Or you lied, Poirot said softly. You pronounced him dead to buy time for the real killer to spirit the body away. Why? Valois' face crumpled. I am not a murderer, but I am a thief. Etienne hired me to catalogue the library. I found a first edition Petrarch, worth a fortune. I planned to steal it. When Julian collapsed, I saw my chance to search the study undisturbed. I found the forged will and panicked. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You planted the digitalis pill to suggest suicide? No, I swear, Bertha interrupted with a sob. It was me, monsieur, the digitalis. I keep foxglove in the still room for my heart. Someone took it. I thought to scare Monsieur Julien, make him leave the chateau. He was cruel to Madame. Madame Duval's voice was ice. You poisoned my nephew. Only enough to sicken, Bertha wailed. A few drops in the decanter. I never meant. Poirot raised a hand. Enough. The dose was cyanide, not digitalis. Someone substituted poisons. Who had access to both the brandy and the study? He turned to Beaumont. You, monsieur. You arrived cloaked, muddied, claiming pursuit. Yet your footprints match the large boots in the study. Explain. Beaumont's six-fingered hand clenched. I've been living in the old gatehouse since spring. Watching, waiting. Etienne's real will was in my possession. I stole it the night he died. I forged the new one to protect Claudine. Etienne planned to disinherit her for rejecting him. When Julian began receiving threats, I knew the killer was back. Last night, I saw a figure in the study, same cloak as mine. I ran. They chased me through the maze. I hid in the fountain until dawn. Poirot produced the scrap of black silk. From your cloak? Beaumont examined it. Mine was wool. This is silk. Someone else wore the disguise. Claudine crushed out her cigarette. Then we have two cloaked figures. One the killer, one the witness. But who took Julian's body? Poirot paced. Let us examine alibis for the critical hours. Julian collapsed at 11:15. Professor Valois pronounced him dead at 11:30. The sheet vanished from the nursery between 3 and 4 a.m. Madame Duval, where were you? In my room, asleep. My maid can confirm. Claudine, walking the dog on the terrace. I saw the cloaked figure at 2:30. I screamed, woke the house. Professor, searching the study. I heard Bertha scream at 3:15, ran upstairs. Bertha, checking the nursery. I saw the sheet move, thought it was Monsieur Julien's ghost. I fled. Beaumont, hiding in the maze until dawn. Poirot stopped before the French doors. All convenient, all unverifiable, but one person has no alibi for the crucial moment. when the brandy was poisoned before dinner. He whirled. Berthet, you served the decanter at 8. You had access to the still room. You admit to digitalis. But cyanide, where did you obtain it? Bertha's moon face crumpled. I found a packet in the old greenhouse, rat poison. I thought to scare the rats from the wine cellar. I never— Liar, Claudine snapped. You hated Julian. He mocked your cooking, your size. You wanted him gone. Bertha sobbed. I loved Madame. I would never— Poirot's voice cut like a blade. Enough. We will test the decanter remnants. But first, he produced the brass raven button. This was found near the west balcony. It matches the buttons on Professor Valois' overcoat. Valois paled. I lost a button weeks ago. Anyone could have taken it. Or planted it, Poirot said, to implicate you, as the forged will implicated Mademoiselle Claudine. He laid the cut goose feather beside the button. This was on my pillow. A threat or a distraction? Goose feathers are used in the still room for stuffing pillows. Bertha? The cook nodded miserably. I plucked them myself. Madame Duval rose. This is madness. We are tearing each other apart while the killer laughs. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Precisely, madame. The killer wants confusion, but Hercule Poirot sees clearly. Let us examine the nursery. They trooped upstairs. The nursery was a cavern of shadows. Toy soldiers still ranked on a dusty shelf. The open window showed scuffed mud on the sill. Someone had climbed out. Poirot knelt, magnifying glass in hand. 2 sets of prints, he announced. 1 barefooted, Berthet's, panicked. 1 booted, larger, heavier. And here, he pointed to a smear of blood on the floorboards. Julian's blood. He was alive when moved. Claudine gasped. Then he's not dead? Digitalis slowed his heart, Valois said. Combined with cyanide, it might have induced a coma. If the dose was calculated precisely, Poirot straightened. Then Julian was carried out alive, to be finished elsewhere. The tire tracks in the drive. Someone drove him away. But who? He led them downstairs to the hall. The tire tracks were deep, wide, a heavy vehicle. Poirot measured them with his cane. A Rolls-Royce, he said, the same model that collected me from Bordeaux. Madame, your car, is it in the garage? Madame Duval's face drained of colour. It was, but the chauffeur reported it missing at dawn. Poirot's smile was grim. Then our killer has fled with Julian, dead or alive, and the proof, but they left something behind. He produced a small silver key from his pocket. Found in the nursery window frame. It opens the bricked-up French doors in the old nursery, the ones Professor Valois mentioned. Someone planned an escape route years ago. Valois' voice was a whisper. The 1890 accident. A child fell. The doors were sealed, but the key was kept in the library, Poirot finished. By you, Professor. You catalogued it. Valois sank into a chair. I gave the key to Etienne years ago. He was obsessed with the doors. Said they were the house's lungs. Madame Duval's hands clenched. Then Charles. Charles Beaumont is not the killer, Poirot said. He is the bait. Someone used his return to lure us into chaos. But the true murderer is cleverer still. He turned to the French doors. Rain had stopped. Weak sunlight filtered through the glass. On the terrace, something glinted. Poirot opened the doors, stepped out. There, half buried in mud, lay a second brass raven button, identical to the first. 2 buttons, he murmured. 1 planted to implicate the professor. 1 dropped in haste by the killer. The overcoat has only 8 buttons. Professor Valois is missing 2. Valois stared at his coat. Impossible! Poirot's voice was gentle. You lost 1 weeks ago. The second was taken last night, while you searched the study. The killer wore your coat to frame you." Claudine's cigarette fell from her fingers. Then who? A scream from the kitchens. They ran. Bertha stood in the pantry doorway, pointing at the floor. A trail of muddy footprints led from the scullery to the wine cellar door, boot prints, large and heavy. Poirot followed. The cellar was vast, vaulted, lit by a single bulb. Bottles gleamed like soldiers in racks. At the far end, a section of wall stood ajar, a false panel. Beyond it, a narrow passage smelled of earth and damp. "The smuggler's tunnel," Madame Duval whispered. "From Prohibition. It leads to the river." Poirot stepped inside. The passage was rough-hewn, dripping. 20 yards in, he found Julian bound, gagged, barely conscious, a bruise blooming on his temple. His eyes widened at Poirot. "Alive!" Poirot breathed. He cut the ropes with his pocket-knife. Julian gasped, coughing. "They drugged me. Cloak thought I was dead." "Who?" Poirot demanded. Julian's voice was a croak. "The professor. Saw him. In the cloak, Valois." They emerged into the cellar. Valois stood with the others, face ashen. Poirot's revolver was in his hand. "Professor Armand Valois," Poirot said, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Julian Duval and the murder of Etienne Duval 15 years ago." Valois smiled, a small, sad thing. "You are too late, monsieur. The proof is gone. The car, the body, the will—" "Non," Poirot said. "The proof is here." He produced the original will from his pocket. "Beaumont gave me the envelope last night. I kept the real document safe. The forgery burns in the kitchen stove even now." Valois lunged for the tunnel, but Beaumont tripped him. The professor fell hard, spectacles skittering across the stone. "It was you," Madame Duval said, voice breaking. "You killed my husband for a book." "For a fortune!" Valois spat. "The Petrarch was worth 50,000 francs. Etienne discovered my theft. I poisoned his brandy, pushed him from the balcony, the perfect accident. Then Julian began asking questions. I forged the will to frame Claudine, poisoned Julian to silence him. The cloak, the shadows, it was all theatre." Poirot's voice was steel. "And the child who fell in 1890? Valois laughed bitterly. "My grandfather. The doors were his obsession. He bricked them up to hide his shame. I reopened them to hide my crime." Julian, supported by Beaumont, stared at his would-be killer. "You bastard! I trusted you." Valois' eyes were mad. "Trust? In this house? The door's open both ways, boy. Life to death, truth to lies." Poirot signalled the footman. "Lock him in the billiard-room until the police arrive." As Valois was led away, Madame Duval sank to her knees. "Etienne," she whispered, "forgive me." Poirot stood amid the wine racks, the French doors a distant rectangle of light. "The case is not closed," he said quietly. "Valois confesses to Etienne's murder, but Julian's poisoning required access to the dining-room decanter. Someone helped him, someone in this room." He turned to Berthe. "You admit to digitalis, but the cyanide—" Bertha's eyes were wide. "I swear, monsieur, I only wanted to scare—" Claudine's voice was silk. "She's lying. She hated Julian. She—" Poirot's gaze swept them. "All? We will know soon. The gendarmerie will test the decanter, the glass, the cellar. But for now, the shadow behind the doors has a face. And Hercule Poirot does not rest until every thread is tied." Outside, the sun broke through, gilding the French doors in fragile gold. The chateau breathed, but its secrets were no longer safe. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Garden Maze. The afternoon sun hung low and sullen, painting the gardens of Chateau de la Mort in shades of bruised gold and rust. Hercule Poirot stood at the entrance to the maze, cane in hand, Homburg hat tilted against the wind that still carried the bite of last night's storm. Behind him, the chateau loomed like a watchful sentinel, its French doors glinting in every window. 12 pairs, as Professor Valois had catalogued, each a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Julien Duval, pale but alive, sat wrapped in blankets on a stone bench near the fountain, a brandy flask clutched in trembling fingers. The gendarmerie had arrived at noon, 2 stolid officers from Périgueux, and a doctor who confirmed the digitalis cyanide cocktail had been precisely measured to induce coma, not death. Valois was locked in the billiard room, guarded by a footman with a shotgun. But Poirot was not satisfied. The professor's confession explained Etienne's murder and the attempt on Julien, yet the forged will, the cloaked figure, the vanished Rolls-Royce, too many threads dangled. "Mon ami," Poirot said to Julien, "you are certain it was Valois you saw in the cloak?" Julien's voice was hoarse. "I woke in the cellar, head splitting. He stood over me, spectacles glinting, cloak billowing. He said, 'The door's open both ways, boy. Time to join your uncle.' Then the needle. Needle?" Poirot's moustache bristled. "Morphine," the doctor said, "to keep me quiet while they moved me." Julien shuddered. "I fought, bit his hand. He dropped the key, the silver one you found." Poirot nodded, the key to the bricked-up nursery doors. Valois had admitted reopening them years ago, but the maze? Why hide Julien there? And the tyre tracks? Why take the rolls if the tunnel led to the river? He turned to the maze. The yew hedges rose 8 feet high, dark and impenetrable, their leaves still dripping from the storm. The entrance was a narrow arch, flanked by stone ravens with outstretched wings. Poirot stepped inside. The paths twisted like the convolutions of a criminal mind. Gravel crunched beneath his patent shoes. The air smelled of wet earth and boxwood. He followed the left wall, cane tapping, eyes scanning for disturbance. 10 minutes in, he found the first clue. A scrap of black wool caught on a thorn. Valois' cloak, perhaps, or the second intruder's. He pocketed it. At the centre stood the marble fountain, the nymph pouring endless water, her face eroded to anonymity. The basin was half full of rainwater, leaves floating like tiny boats. Poirot knelt, peering into the depths. Something glinted. He rolled up his sleeve, fished out a sodden leather wallet. Inside, a passport in the name of Charles Beaumont, stamped with a 1973 Indochina visa, and a photograph of a younger Valois, arm in arm with Etienne Duval. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. Valois had claimed to meet Etienne only after the war. A lie. He pressed on. The maze had 4 exits. Valois had sketched on his plan. 1 led to the river tunnel, 1 to the old greenhouse, 1 to the stables, 1 back to the chateau. Poirot took the greenhouse path. The glass house was a relic, Victorian ironwork laced with ivy, panes cracked or missing. Inside, the air was humid, redolent of rot and night blooming cereus. Orchids sprawled like spiders. A lemon tree bore shriveled fruit. On the potting bench lay a packet labelled cyanure de potassium, rat poison, half empty. Beside it, a hypodermic syringe and a vial of morphine. And there, half buried in peat, the missing button from Valois' overcoat, brass raven, identical to the others. Poirot's lips pursed. Valois had been here, but the footprints in the soft earth were smaller. Bare feet again, Bertha's size. He followed them to a door at the rear, hidden behind a trellis of passion flower. It opened onto a neglected orchard, apples rotting on the ground. Beyond, the river glinted through willows. He returned to the maze, taking the river path. The tunnel entrance was concealed behind a false panel of yew, cleverly hinged, recently oiled. Inside, the smuggler's passage stretched dark and damp, the river's murmur echoing. 20 yards in, he found the Rolls-Royce key, silver, engraved with the Duval crest, discarded in a puddle. Someone drove the car into the tunnel, Poirot mused, then walked out. But why? Back in the garden, he summoned the household. They gathered by the fountain, Madame Duval in black, Claudine in a crimson coat that clashed with the autumn leaves, Berthe wringing her apron, Beaumont smoking a pipe, Julien propped against a plinth. The gendarmes stood at a discreet distance. "Mes amis," Poirot began, "we have a confession, but not the whole truth. Professor Valois poisoned Etienne for a book. He attempted to poison Julien to silence him. But the forged will, the cloaked figure, the vanished car, these require a confederate. Someone who knew the maze, the tunnel, the greenhouse. Someone who moved Julien while Valois distracted us with his theatrical ghost." He produced the passport. Valois lied about his friendship with Etienne. They were partners in crime long before the Petrarch theft. But the cyanide, the morphine, the rolls, these were not Valois' doing alone. Berthe sobbed. "I told you, monsieur. I only wanted to scare." Poirot's gaze fixed on her. "You admit to digitalis in the brandy. But the cyanide packet in the greenhouse, your fingerprints are on it, yes?" Berthe nodded miserably. "I found it years ago. Kept it for rats. Someone took it last week." "Someone," Poirot echoed. "Or you gave it. You loved Etienne. You hated Julien for mocking Madame. But you are not clever enough to forge a will or drive a Rolls through a tunnel." He turned to Claudine. "Mademoiselle, you inherit under the forgery. You were Beaumont's lover. You walked the terrace at 2:30, saw the cloaked figure, convenient." Claudine's violet eyes flashed. "I screamed to wake the house. If I were the killer, why draw attention?" "To establish your alibi," Poirot said. "You knew Valois would be blamed. You took the sheet from the nursery, wrapped Julien, carried him to the cellar while Berthe panicked upstairs." Julien's voice was weak. "Claudine, you?" Claudine laughed, sharp as breaking glass. "Absurd. I'm no murderess." Poirot produced the silver key. "This opened the bricked-up doors. Valois had it, but the scratches on the lock are fresh, made by a woman's nail file." He held up Claudine's manicure set, the emerald file missing. "You climbed out the nursery window, barefooted to avoid noise, met Valois in the maze. Together you moved Julien to the tunnel, planning to drown him in the river and sink the Rolls as evidence." Madame Duval's hand flew to her throat. "Claudine, my husband's ward!" Claudine's smile was venom. "Etienne promised me everything, then changed his will when I refused him. Charles forged the new one to protect me. Valois helped, for a price. When Julien started digging, we decided to finish what Etienne began." Beaumont crushed his pipe. "You bitch! I came back to save Julien, not kill him." Claudine shrugged. "You were useful. The cloak, the passport, distractions. Valois wore my silk cloak to confuse the footprints." Poirot's voice was steel. "But you made one mistake. The Rolls key, you dropped it in the tunnel in your haste. And the bare footprints, Berthe's size, but the stride is longer. A woman running. You!" Claudine bolted. She darted into the maze, crimson coat flashing between the hedges. The gendarmes pursued, shouting. Poirot followed at a measured pace, cane tapping. The maze was no mystery to him now. He knew its heart. He found her at the fountain, cornered, panting. The nymph poured water over her bowed head like a baptism. "It's over, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "The door's open both ways. You chose the wrong one." Claudine lunged, nails raking for his eyes. Poirot sidestepped. She stumbled, fell into the basin. The gendarmes hauled her out, dripping, screaming. Back at the chateau, Valois was brought from the billiard room. He stared at Claudine, betrayed. "You promised me the Pétrarque," he spat. "I promised you nothing," Claudine sneered. "You were a tool, like Etienne, like Julien." Madame Duval stood silent, tears carving channels through her powder. "I raised you," she whispered, "like a daughter." Claudine's laugh was broken. "You raised a pawn. Etienne's death was your fault. You drove him to despair with your jealousy." Poirot raised a hand. "Enough. The gendarmerie will sort the details. But one mystery remains." He turned to Beaumont. "You, monsieur, you returned with the real will. Why?" Beaumont's six-fingered hand trembled. "Guilt. I forged the first will to protect Claudine, but Etienne's death, I never wanted that. Valois acted alone. When I learned Julien was in danger, I came back to make amends." Poirot nodded. "Then you are free to go. The chateau is Julien's now. The doors will be sealed. No more openings both ways." As the prisoners were led away, Poirot lingered in the garden. The sun set behind the maze, casting long shadows that pointed like accusing fingers. He placed the brass raven button on the fountain's rim. "Adieu, Château de la Mort," he murmured. "Your secrets are buried at last." But as he turned to leave, a final glint caught his eye. Beneath the nymph's foot, half submerged, lay a gold locket, engraved with the initials E.D. inside, a curl of dark hair, and a faded photograph of a child. Poirot's fingers closed around it. Another secret, perhaps, or merely a ghost of the past. He slipped it into his pocket and walked back to the chateau, where the French doors stood closed for the first time in centuries, their glass reflecting a sky finally clear. Chapter 8. The Midnight Confession. The chateau was silent at last, but it was the silence of a held breath. Midnight had come and gone, and the great clock in the hall struck one with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the winter dining room. The long table cleared except for a single candelabrum and the scattered relics of the case. The brass raven button, the cut goose feather, the silver key, the water-stained will, the cyanide packet, the emerald nail file. The French doors were locked and bolted. Outside, the garden lay black and dripping under a moonless sky. Poirot's eyes were closed, but his mind revolved like a precision watch. Valois and Claudine were in the billiard room, handcuffed to opposite cue racks, guarded by the two gendarmes. Julien slept upstairs under sedation. Madame Duval had retired to her suite with a sleeping draught. Berthe had been dismissed to the servants' wing with a warning. Beaumont had vanished into the night with the promise of a full statement in Périgueux. Yet Poirot was not satisfied. A single thread, thin, almost invisible, still vibrated in the web. He opened his eyes at the soft creak of a floorboard. The service door from the pantry opened a finger's breadth. A shadow slipped through. Madame Eleanore Duval, barefoot in a black silk robe, hair unbound, a candle in her trembling hand. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "I must speak before the police take them away, before it is too late." Poirot rose, pulled out a chair. "Sit, madame. The house is asleep. We are alone." She sat, the candle guttering between them. Her face was stripped of powder and poise. She looked suddenly old. "I lied," she said, "from the beginning. The letter from Charles, it was not blackmail. It was a confession. He wrote that I killed Etienne, that he had proof. I burned the letter, but the words burned in me. I invited you here not to solve a mystery, but to prove myself innocent or to be caught." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Continue." She drew a shuddering breath. 15 years ago, Etienne was ruining us. Cognac prices collapsed. He gambled, drank, took Claudine as his mistress, though she was Charles's. I found letters. Claudine begging Charles to forge a will, leaving her everything. Etienne laughed when I confronted him. That night he locked himself in the west study with a bottle. I heard him on the balcony singing drunkenly. I went to him. We fought. He struck me. I pushed him, only to free myself. He stumbled, fell backward over the balustrade. I screamed, but it was too late. Poirot's eyes never left her face. And Charles? He saw everything from the garden. He helped me stage the accident, moved the brandy glass, wiped the balustrade. In return, I paid him to disappear. I thought it ended there. Then Julian began asking questions. Valois, greedy for the Petrarch, offered to silence him. Claudine wanted the inheritance. They acted without my knowledge, but on the foundation of my crime. She opened her hand. On the table fell a gold locket, the one Poirot had found in the fountain. Inside, the curl of dark hair and the child's photograph. "My daughter," she said, "born in 1918. Etienne's bastard with a vineyard worker. She died at 3, fell from the nursery balcony when the French doors were open. Etienne blamed me for leaving them unlatched. He never forgave. The house became our prison." Poirot picked up the locket. "And the cloak? I kept it. Burned it in the kitchen stove the night Etienne died. But the silk lining? I cut a square for the locket. The scrap you found was mine." She reached into her robe, produced a small crystal vial. "Cyanide, from the greenhouse. I took it tonight. If you had not solved it, I would have drunk it in the garden where he fell." Poirot's hand closed over the vial. "No, madame, justice is not yours to administer." Tears carved silver tracks down her cheeks. "Then take me to the police. Let it end." Poirot stood. "First we finish the story. The forged will. Your handwriting." She nodded. "Charles taught me. I changed it after Etienne's death to protect Julian. Claudine would have squandered everything. Valois altered it again to frame her. And the midnight ghost? Berthe. She saw me on the balcony tonight, thought I was Etienne's spirit. She screamed. The rest was Valois' theatre." Poirot extinguished the candle. In the darkness, her voice was a thread. "I loved him, monsieur, even when I hated him. The doors opened both ways. Love to hate, life to death. I chose the wrong side." Poirot took her arm. "Come, the gendarmes will hear your confession. Julian will decide your fate. He is the master now." They walked through the silent corridors. The French doors stood closed, moonlight silvering the glass. At the billiard room, Poirot knocked. The gendarmes opened, startled to see Madame Duval in her robe, wrists already extended. "Madame Eleanore Duval," Poirot said formally, "confesses to the manslaughter of her husband Etienne Duval, and to conspiracy in the attempted murder of Julien Duval." Valois laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "So the Queen falls at last," Claudine spat. "You coward! You let us take the blame." Madame Duval's gaze was steady. "I let you take the punishment you deserved. My crime was the seed, yours was the poison." The gendarmes led her away. Poirot watched the procession. Valois, Claudine, Madame Duval, 3 shadows swallowed by the chateau's moor. The billiard-room door closed with a thud like a tomb. Upstairs, Julien waited in the winter dining room, bandaged but awake. Poirot handed him the locket. "Your aunt's confession. The estate is yours, but the doors will be bricked up. No more openings both ways." Julien turned the locket in his fingers. "She killed my uncle, tried to kill me, yet she saved me in the end." "Love and hate," Poirot said, "the oldest motive, the oldest mystery." Dawn crept through the French doors as the police vans crunched down the gravel. Poirot stood on the terrace. the garden maze a dark smudge below. The fountain's nymph poured her endless water. The ravens on the gate kept their eternal watch. He lit a small cigar, exhaling smoke into the cold, clean air. "Adieu, Château de la Mort," he murmured. "Your ghosts are laid to rest." But as he turned to leave, a final glint caught his eye. Beneath the terrace balustrade, half hidden by ivy, lay a single white feather, uncut, pristine. Poirot picked it up, twirled it between his fingers. "Perhaps not all," he said softly. "Perhaps one door remains." He slipped the feather into his pocket beside the locket and walked toward the waiting car. The chateau's shadow stretching long behind him. The French doors reflecting a sky finely, mercifully clear. Chapter 9. The Poisoned Legacy. The morning after the confessions, Château de la Mort lay under a thin frost that turned the gardens to crystal and the French doors to mirrors of ice. Hercule Poirot had not slept. He stood in the winter dining room at dawn, fully dressed in charcoal grey, a single cup of chocolate cooling untouched beside him. On the table lay the final pieces of the puzzle: the white feather, uncut, pristine, the gold locket with its child's curl, the original will, the forged will, the cyanide packet, the emerald nail file, the silver key, and, newly added, a small glass vial containing a residue of clear liquid. The label, in faded ink, read aconitine, 1/1000. Poirot's little grey cells were in full revolt. Madame Duval's midnight confession had tied the central knot, her push, Etienne's fall, the staged accident, but the peripheral threads still fluttered. The aconitine, the uncut feather, the second cloak of silk, the precise calibration of Julian's death. Someone had orchestrated the chaos with a conductor's baton, and that someone was not yet in custody. He summoned the household to the dining room at 9. The gendarmes had taken Valois, Claudine, and Madame Duval to Périgueux at first light. Only Julian remained, pale and bandaged, supported by Beaumont, who had returned at dawn with a lawyer and a conscience. Berthe bustled in with coffee and brioche, her eyes red from weeping. The footman stood at attention, faces blank. "Mes amis," Poirot began, "the case is not closed. Madame Duval confessed to manslaughter and conspiracy. Valois and Claudine admitted their parts. Yet the poison that nearly killed Monsieur Julien was not the cyanide in the greenhouse, nor the digitalis in Bertha's still-room. It was aconitine, monkshood, extracted with precision in this very house. And the uncut feather on the terrace was no threat. It was a signal. He held up the vial, found at 6 a.m. in the potting shed, hidden beneath a sack of bone meal. The cork bears teeth marks. Someone opened it in haste. Aconitine is swift, painless, and leaves no odour. One drop in brandy would fell a man in minutes. Yet Julian survived. Why? Julian's voice was weak. Because I didn't drink the brandy. I poured it out on the balcony when you were distracted. I tasted the bitterness, remembered Uncle Etienne's last night. I faked the collapse. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Précisément. You suspected poison. But who knew you would pour it out? Who adjusted the dose for a man who might only sip? He turned to Beaumont. You, monsieur, you arrived with the real will, claiming guilt. Yet your passport was in the fountain, planted. Your cloak was wool, but the silk scrap came from Madame Duval's robe. You staged your own pursuit. Beaumont's 6-fingered hand clenched. I told you, I came to save Julian. No, you came to inherit. Poirot produced a document from his pocket, a codicil to the original will, dated 3 days before Etienne's death, witnessed by Beaumont and a notary in Bordeaux. If Julian died without issue, the estate passed to Etienne's blood kin. You, his illegitimate half-brother. The polydactyly proves it. Etienne's mother had the trait. You hid it for years." Julian stared. "You're my uncle?" Beaumont's smile was bitter. "Your father's bastard. He acknowledged me in secret, promised me the vineyards if Julian proved unworthy. When Etienne died, I forged the will with Claudine to protect my claim. Valois helped for the Petrarch. Madame Duval pushed Etienne to protect her marriage, but I planned the perfect murder. Aconitine in the brandy, digitalis to slow the heart, cyanide odor to confuse. Julian's survival was unexpected." Poirot's voice was silk over steel. "You wore the silk cloak to mimic Madame Duval's ghost. You planted the passport, the button, the feather. You drove the rolls into the tunnel to stage Julian's escape, then walked out to discover him. But the uncut feather was your signal to Bertha. She was to scream at 3:15 a.m., drawing us to the nursery while you moved Julian to the cellar." Bertha sobbed. "He promised me a cottage if I helped. I thought only to scare Monsieur Julien, not kill him." Poirot's gaze swept the room. "The maze, the tunnel, the greenhouse, all your stage. You extracted aconitine from monkshood in the potting shed. Your mother was a chemist, yes? You calibrated the dose for a sip, not a swallow. When Julian faked death, you adjusted, morphine to keep him quiet, the rolls to remove him. But you left the vial, careless." Beaumont lunged for the French doors. The gendarmes caught him, wrestled him to the floor. Julian stood, trembling. "You tried to kill me for vineyards." Beaumont spat blood. "For my birthright. Etienne promised. He lied, like all Duvals." Poirot signalled the gendarmes. "Charles Beaumont, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Julien Duval and conspiracy in the murder of Etienne Duval." As Beaumont was dragged away, Poirot turned to Julian. "The estate is yours, clean. The codicil is void, forged after Etienne's death. Madame Duval's confession stands, but her sentence will be light. Bertha will face charges for accessory." Julian sank into a chair. "And the doors?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Bricked up by noon. No more openings both ways." He stepped onto the terrace. The frost was melting. The garden steamed in the rising sun. The maze looked almost benign, its secrets laid bare. He placed the uncut feather on the balustrade, watched it flutter away on the breeze. "Adieu, poisoned legacy," he murmured. "The truth is the only antidote." The chateau's shadow shortened as the sun climbed. For the first time in centuries, the French doors stood open to a future unclouded by the past. Chapter 10. Poirot's Grand Revelation. The winter dining room had been transformed into a theatre of justice. Every French door stood wide, letting in the pale November sunlight and the scent of wet boxwood. The long table was bare, except for a single silver tray bearing 12 crystal glasses, each filled with clear water, each labelled in Poirot's neat violet script. Around it sat the remnants of the house. Julien Duval, pale but upright. Bertha, apron clutched like a shield. The two gendarmes. Inspector Joly from Périgueux, notebook open, and at the foot of the table, Charles Beaumont, wrists, cuffed 6-fingered hands resting on the mahogany. Hercule Poirot entered at precisely 11 o'clock, immaculate in midnight blue, cane tapping a measured cadence. He paused beneath the chandelier, surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a maestro before the final chord, and began. "Mesdames et messieurs, we have confessions, many, overlapping, contradictory." Madame Duval pushed her husband in a moment of rage. Professor Valois poisoned the brandy for a book. Mademoiselle Claudine forged a will for love and greed. Berthe added digitalis to frighten. Monsieur Beaumont calibrated aconitine to inherit. Yet one truth binds them all. The death behind the French doors was never a single act. It was a symphony of motives played on the same instrument, these doors themselves. He gestured to the open glass panels. Sunlight fractured into rainbows across the parquet. 15 years ago, Etienne Duval stood on the west balcony, drunk, cruel, threatening to disinherit his nephew, his ward, his bastard brother. Madame Duval pushed him to silence him. Charles Beaumont watched from the garden, ready to help stage the accident. Valois, lurking for the Petrarch, added poison to ensure silence. Claudine, in the corridor, heard the plan and agreed to the forgery. Berthe, listening at the keyhole, slipped digitalis into the decanter to protect her mistress. 5 hands, 1 fall, the perfect crime, because no single hand was guilty alone. Inspector Jolly's pen scratched furiously. Julian's eyes were wide. Poirot lifted the first glass. Water from the fountain where the locket was found. Madame Duval's push. He lifted the second. Water from the West Study decanter, Valois' poison. Third, water from the still room, Berthe's digitalis. Fourth, water from the potting shed, Beaumont's aconitine. Fifth, water from the nursery window, Claudine's forged will. He set them in a perfect circle. Each act harmless alone. Together, death. The French doors were the stage, open to the balcony, open to the garden, open to the maze, open to the tunnel. They allowed every player access, every motive entry. The house itself was the murderer. He turned to Beaumont. You returned not to save Julian, but to complete the symphony. You knew the others would confess fragments. You staged the cloaked ghost, the vanished rolls, the uncut feather, your signal to Berthe to scream and draw us away, while you moved Julian to the cellar. You calibrated the aconitine for a sip, expecting Julian to drink. When he poured it out, you adapted, morphine, the tunnel, the staged rescue. But you left the vial, and the feather careless. Beaumont's laugh was hollow. You'll never prove it. They all confess. I'm just the witness. Poirot produced a small recorder. Modern, discreet. Your confession to Berthe in the potting shed, 6:15 a.m. 1 drop for the boy. The estate is mine. The gendarme outside heard every word. Beaumont's face crumpled. Poirot turned to Julian. The estate is yours, but the poison is purged. Madame Duval will serve 5 years for manslaughter. Valois and Claudine, 20 for attempted murder. Berthe, 2 for accessory. Beaumont, life for conspiracy and intent. He lifted the 6th glass, empty. This is for the child who fell in 1890. The first victim of the doors. Her death haunted Etienne, drove his cruelty, seeded every crime. The house is exorcised. He poured the contents of the 5 poisoned glasses into the empty one. The water swirled, clear, harmless. Truth dilutes poison, he said. The doors will be bricked up by sundown, the maze cut back, the fountain drained. Château de la Mort becomes Château de la Vie. Julian stood, steady now. And you, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot smiled, the first genuine smile of the weekend. I return to London, to order, to symmetry, and to a cup of chocolate that is not poisoned. He raised the final glass, his own filled with chocolate, and toasted the room. To the little grey cells, and to doors that open only one way, forward. The gendarmes led Beaumont away. Berthe wept quietly. Julian placed the locket on the tray, closed it with a click. Outside, workmen began bricking up the French doors, one by one, the sound of trowels against mortar, a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Poirot stepped onto the terrace for the last time. The garden was already changing, hedges trimmed, the maze half dismantled, the fountain dry. He placed the uncut white feather on the balustrade. The wind caught it, carried it high above the vineyards, over the Dordogne. into a sky finally irrevocably clear. "Adieu," he whispered. "The symphony is ended. The curtain falls." He turned, cane-tapping, and walked toward the waiting car. Behind him, the last French door was sealed with fresh mortar, the Raven Crest buried forever. The chateau stood blind, its eyes closed, its secrets interred. Hercule Poirot did not look back.